in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, the United States is also participating in their version of the imperial era. The United States, if it wasn't clear already that the United States was an imperial nation, it is certainly clear at this point that we are an imperial nation. So our big question today is, why would a country want to expand its power and control? What is the value in doing that? Why would the United States become an imperial nation if you're under the impression that the United States was not an imperial nation before this? And so be thinking about that as we talk today. So for those that don't remember, imperialism is to extend a nation's power by gaining territories to build a colonial empire. Another definition of imperialism is to dominate trade and government of other lands, basically to take over more territory. My question to you when we're talking about this era is, does it seem ironic that the United States would even have an imperial era? Do you think this idea of imperialism taking over control of other places is against democracy? So far, every country or every territory that we've taken over in the Louisiana Purchase, in Texas, in Mexico, those places became states. And so in many ways, it's just sort of extending democracy to other people. In the imperial era, that's not really the case. We do not extend democracy to most of the people that we take over. The political cartoon to the right here is really important. It's a picture of England. Most of the time in cartoons, England is pictured with some sort of top hat. That's usually a big sign for England. They're also chubbier, sort of bloated with wealth. That's another like rich, snotty way to look at England. So here you can see that England is sort of an octopus taking over many, many lands. And this is really important for us to understand that when we're talking about social Darwinism, this idea of survival of the fittest applied to economics. England is proving that they are one of the fittest. They are taking over parts of the world. And specifically, if you didn't know this, Egypt, India, and Canada, those three pieces of land right down in the bottom, are probably the most important. You should know that those were formerly controlled by England. Canada still is loyal to the Queen. So these different places are loyal to England, but England is occupying them and taking them over and expanding. So if you're an American during this time and you are seeing the English continuing to expand their control around the globe, you know that you need to compete at this time too. So the United States begins its expansion pretty early on. In 1867, which is 2 years after the close of the Civil War, Henry Seward, who's pictured here to the right, you should remember him. He was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, and then again in 1867, he's the Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson. Henry Seward decides to purchase Alaska, and this was known as Seward's Folly. Folly means foolish. So this is known as Seward's sort of foolish journey. He went and negotiated with Alaska. And you can see this political cartoon here is picturing the negotiations. Andy here, the little guy sitting in the chair, is supposed to be the Emperor of Russia. And the emperor's looking in the mirror and he's seeing himself as this big ruler, super powerful. And Seward is dressed as sort of this like housemaid, he's or maybe even an old maid, wearing a dress, maybe a nurse, getting him like sort of buttering him up with the Russian salve there, to get him ready, to sell Alaska to the United States. The Russians were in a recession at this time, so they sort of had some incentive to sell Alaska, so that they could make at least a little bit of money off of it. Ultimately, he purchased Alaska from Russia for less than 2 cents an acre. And we know today that Alaska is a gold mine for natural resources. There are tons of oil reserves there, but beyond that, it's a huge fishing capital for us. We have tons of exports that come out of Alaska. And interestingly, if you live in Alaska today, you actually get paid money by the government to live there because they make so much money off of their exports that they can actually pay their people to live there instead of taxing them. So why else, so that was a relatively peaceful purchase. And throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s, people are getting really excited about expanding our power and our influence in the world. So these are some of the reasons why we might want to become imperial for military reasons. So the first is nationalism. Nationalism is extreme pride in your country. And having that extreme pride, you want to be like, my military is the best, and we can beat any military that we want. And so we also, in order to expand, we need to improve our Navy. So many people that were imperial during this time were advocating for giving money to the Navy. So we needed a modern naval fleet to protect business interests overseas. So we need a strong military in order to imperialize, in order to expand our business overseas. We want to be able to protect anybody who is doing business that makes money for Americans abroad. How do we do this? How do we expand our military? And how do we become imperial using our military? We use force to support or overthrow regimes. And we establish and maintain overseas military bases. We have over 700 military bases around the world today, and it's a major point of contention for most smaller countries that have our military bases there. Many people see our military bases as a means of occupation. But in 1890s, we did not have any military bases overseas. And so many people saw that as something we should start doing so that we can start having influence overseas. There were also economic reasons for imperialism. We wanted to find foreign markets to sell our industrial goods to. So specifically, we wanted to target places that had maybe a lot of natural resources, but didn't have a lot of goods and that they can sell to us. So by that I mean we wanted to become trade partners with places that didn't have manufacturing, so that we could sell them all the things that we manufacture. We were in major competition with Europe over manufacturing. And so it was really sort of a competition of who could get to these untapped people who might want our shirts, our cars, our other things that we're producing at this time. So we used foreign trade to solve our economic depression. If we can sell and export a lot of things out, then maybe we might be able to stay afloat. People aren't buying we actually produced more in the Industrial Revolution than we had people to sell it to. So our production was through the roof. Social Darwinism. We want to expand economically because survival of the fittest. If we don't, England's going to, or France is going to. It's sort of like, we've got to compete to survive, and we just got to keep fighting till we beat them out. So the way we expand economically is we exploit other countries for their raw materials and natural resources. Basically, we say to China, we want X, Y, and Z of your resources. We want, maybe it's their labor, maybe it's other things. We say to places in Africa that we want these resources. In the Middle East, for sure, we want their oil, that type of thing. And we make countries dependent on our agriculture and our manufacturing, which are the two biggest things that our country exported at the time. Today, agriculture is still our largest export. There are some political factors for imperialism. The first is that we believed that our culture is superior to other cultures. So we would do things like send missionaries. Missionaries are typically Christian, people that go over to try to spread Christianity abroad. We also believed that our race, particularly the Anglo-Saxon race, which is anybody from English descent, we believed that our race was superior to other races. We also, in order to do this, we had to employ certain methods. We needed to pressure local governments, so we would use sort of our maybe economic or military pressure, or just sort of social, sort of cultural pressure to get local governments to allow our people to come in, to get them to sort of follow our ways of doing things. We also wanted to spread Anglo-Saxon identity. We wanted to encourage people to democratize, to spread democracy, to use democracy. Because if they use democracy, then they'll work with us. But if they are, used to sort of getting their way, or if they're used to sort of controlling everything within their country, then they might not be willing to work with us. We also want to spread Christianity. And so, missionaries going abroad is also part of it. We want to civilize people. Many cultures seemed really backwards compared to American cultures. And by backwards, I mean maybe not as industrial. And so in the industrial era, since that was something that we arguably evolved to get to, we saw industrialization as the next step in the evolution of humanity. And so anybody that hadn't industrialized, that were pre-industrial, they were not civilized, and that is certainly arguable given all the things we know about how civilized our industrial revolution was in terms of the treatment of the poor. We also saw the spread of democracy, the spread of Christianity, and teaching people how to be civilized as sort of our burden. If you are on top, then maybe it's your responsibility to raise up the people on the bottom. Maybe it's your responsibility to teach them. And this is known as the white man's burden. You can see the white man's burden expressed in this political cartoon to the right. The line in between, it says, before the United States intervened on behalf of these oppressed people. Meaning these people had no idea their rights, they had no idea their needs before the United States became involved. And so here they go from dealing with industrial slavery, Spanish oppression, being a worker, a hard worker, dealing with all these pandemics and other issues. Obviously, all these people are dressed in ragged clothes. And then when the United States intervenes on their behalf, they have money, they dress nice, they can stand up straight. This is propaganda trying to encourage people to support imperialization, maybe even to be a missionary, to support democracy, to uplift these people and Christianize them and show them the opportunities that are available to them. And this is certainly an example of the white man's burden. Now, not everybody was pro-imperialism. There was certainly a lot of opposition. Many people felt like imperialism is against the ideals of democracy. The phrase self-determination, it simply means the ability to determine your own government. Many people felt like if we go over and take over a country and either incorporate them into the United States or just tell them that they are part of the United States as a territory or protect them, then we're not really giving them the chance to decide what type of government they want. Maybe they don't want to be a democracy. If they did, they would probably have their own revolution and establish a democracy. Other people felt like if we are truly a democracy, true democracy is peaceful. It's working things out democratically by talking, by negotiations. And so if we go over and take over places, we are not really promoting what we're about. And many people felt like we should promote peace, not conquest. And sort of the undercurrent of this is we'd seen a lot of wars at this point, especially during this time. People were especially some of the older people in government, had participated in the Civil War, maybe even the Mexican War. Not too many people in the 1880s had been alive during the War of 1812, but we'd seen a lot of wars, and many people were pretty sick of people dying on behalf of the country. Also, it's really expensive to be an imperial nation. You have to expand your control, you have to build up your military, you have to build up your army, you have to pay all those people, you have to build ships, which costs money, and then, of course, you have to feed all those people. You might need to, rebuild parts of countries that you take over, that type of thing. It's really expensive. And so many people just did not think that that was a good use of our government funds, especially during the Industrial Revolution when there are so many poor people and poverty issues here in our own country. It also, when you conquer other places, many of those places will rebel against you. And why would we want to fight it? Why would we want to fight people that and control people that don't want us to control them at all? There are also too many domestic issues, like I mentioned. Immigration was a huge problem. There were too many immigrants coming in, according to most Americans at the time. And of course, if you let all these people come to our country, it means you're letting in, especially when we're talking about Cubans and Filipinos and Puerto Ricans, we're talking about non-white people. And so many people were worried that if we take over these countries, that might open the door for them to immigrate here, meaning more not white people coming to our country. And for the racist people of the era, that was a problem. We also had a lot of poverty, and so white people of the time were really upset that we might be spending money on something that doesn't necessarily directly benefit them. And then we also had progressive reform issues. Progressive reforms were obviously things like dealing with the poverty, unionization, but other things like improving meat packing during this time. There's a famous book written, which we'll learn about, that exposes the meat packing industry. Environmentalism. Our environment, specifically here in New Hampshire, our trees are being hacked down for industrial purposes to make money, and capitalism has kind of gone haywire. If you actually look at pictures of the White Mountains from the 1800s, there are no trees in it. Literally, it's just stumps everywhere. And we had serious flood problems because the trees wouldn't actually soak up the water from the mountains, and so when it rained, water just ran down because there were no trees to sort of take in all the water. So we had serious flooding problems, and so there are many environmental issues. We start to form the national parks and other things. Women's rights is a problem. Black rights, civil rights is still a problem. And so there are so many progressive reforms going on at this time. Many people wish that money was going towards those. Progressives, if you don't know, means progress. Obviously, people that are trying to take us from where we are and move us forward. But from a political perspective, what progressive means is people that favor government regulation, the government getting involved, and fixing the problem over the problem getting fixed through, natural means or through individual citizens taking it upon themselves to fix the problem. A progressive is pretty much the opposite of a libertarian in many respects. The political cartoon here, Uncle Sam is looking at the menu. There's a Cuba steak, which is an option. There's a Puerto Rico pig, which he could have. There are sandwich islands. I can't read what it says under the Philippines, but you get the idea. So the menu are all these little islands, and President McKinley is the waiter there. It says McKinley on his napkin. He's, asking Uncle Sam what his order is. What do you want, Uncle Sam? I will provide that for you. Additionally, people are really worried about imperialism for ethnocentric reasons and not in the way that you think. Many people are really, you're worried about etnocentric means you are centered on your ethnicity. You are worried about your ethnicity and your ethnicity alone. And so many people are like, why do we need to care about all these other countries and all their little problems on those islands? And so many people were worried that expansion would actually tarnish our society because we'd be spending money on other places. But then also, we would be allowing dark-skinned people to immigrate to the United States, and for many, that was reason not to imperialize. So how do we maintain peace during the imperial era? Many people who were anti-imperialists didn't want to expand, and so they thought that maybe, we don't need to take over these places. Maybe we can just provide a good example for them. Others said that we should support the rights and respect of other countries. Maybe we should, encourage them to become a democracy, but say you get to decide what it is you want to do. You get to determine your path. The other way that we stay out of imperialism and we stop doing that is we just stay out of their issues. If there's an oppressive government in one of those islands, we let the people rebel against their own government, and we don't get involved in fixing that. The election of 1900 is a really interesting election. Imperialism was the major issue. Basically, should we expand or not? McKinley won, but was assassinated quickly afterwards. Theodore Roosevelt was his vice president, and so Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, quickly became president after McKinley's assassination. His assassination is pretty interesting. Andrew Jackson was the first president to ever have an attempted assassination on him. He was actually saved by Davy Crockett. And after that, there were a couple other presidents that had attempted assassinations on them. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And so after Andrew Jackson, many people for the first time were like, maybe we should have some people that have a job to protect the president. And so we actually have the sort of initial creation of the Secret Service. And the Secret Service is basically just a group of men and women whose responsibility it is to protect the government. They're always standing near him. They're the people with the earpieces and that are constantly wearing the sunglasses and freaking out. So by the time McKinley's president in 1900, this is the Secret Service is in full swing, and McKinley was going around New York actually giving talks. I believe he was in Buffalo giving talks about maybe even imperialism, and he actually is trying to evade the Secret Service because he thinks they're annoying, and that having these people stalking him all the time is bothering him. He actually snuck out the window of his hotel room a couple times, and this was becoming an increasing problem. And then days later, he's actually assassinated by this guy who walks up to him with a gun and kills him. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. And Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley ran on an imperial ticket. That was their plan. We are going to imperialize. We are going to take over other countries. This is our vision. You can see from this political cartoon that Teddy Roosevelt sees himself as the world's police, and he is going to get involved in local issues. He is going to fix their problems. He is going to be the bridge between the Europeans and all these poor people around the world who need the help of the Americans. He has a stick here. It's cut off, but it says big stick diplomacy. And this is basically his method. Big stick diplomacy means, and this is a direct quote from Teddy Roosevelt, he said, speak softly and carry a big stick. In other words, threaten military force in order to get things done. And he basically said we need to have a powerful military to act if that ever became necessary. This is known as Roosevelt's corollary meaning correlation, or connection, or maybe change, or add-on, or reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. He said Europe needed to stay out of Western affairs. He said the United States had the right to intervene between Europe and Central and South American countries. And so, even though the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember, was a little wishy-washy, when President Monroe, James Monroe, gave the Monroe Doctrine speech, he wasn't very clear. He basically said, Europe, you should stay out, but if you don't, we may or may not do something. African Americans, or not African Americans, South Americans, we support you in trying to win your independence, but, we won't actually do anything directly to support you. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. It was very unclear. And Roosevelt is basically saying, no, we will do something. We will be involved. And so in the early 1900s, we see the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically, we are going to start to assert ourselves as the policemen for the world, and we are going to get things done. Another president, the president that quickly follows Teddy Roosevelt, is a man named William Howard Taft. And he takes the same general ideas of big stick diplomacy, but he calls it dollar diplomacy. At this time, by the time Taft is president, we are an economic superpower. We export more things around the world. We produce so much in our factories that we are economically extremely powerful. And so he says we don't need to use military force. We can just use economic force. We can basically say we can provide sanctions. Basically, if you don't do what we want, we can not trade with you. And if we don't trade with you, that will probably hurt your economy. And so he incorporates this. He calls it dollar diplomacy, which is just using economic power to achieve political goals. And he used this to keep American dominance in Latin America. The United States' involvement in Latin America provided stability and essentially established the United States as the dominant country in this hemisphere. It also created resentment. Many people in South American and Central American countries started to resent the United States and see us almost as the enemy. Like, we are helping them, but only when it benefits us. The last president in the quote-unquote imperial era is Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is president during World War I. Interestingly, fun fact, Woodrow Wilson has a stroke while he's in office, and many people believe that his wife actually ran the presidency towards the end of his presidency. Woodrow Wilson promoted something called moral democracy, and he is a little bit less imperial than perhaps his predecessors. He believes in self-determination, or the freedom to determine one's own government without outside involvement. He didn't think that it was our job to go around the world telling other countries how to be. And he could do that because his predecessors had already gone around the world telling other countries how to be, so he didn't have to. So it made it easy for him to take that position. But interestingly, while he promoted self-determination and talked about moral democracy or moral diplomacy, he actually intervened in Latin America and Mexico more than his predecessors. One of the big ones was he intervened in the Mexican Riviera to secure some economic interests there. And then, of course, many people, including our dear friend Howard Zinn, argue that World War I itself was an imperial war for the United States because World War I, when we learn about that coming up, World War I essentially solidifies American control in the world. It establishes us as one of the top players, I'd say top 5 players in the world, if it wasn't already clear before that. Teddy Roosevelt, while he's president, does something really important, and that is he builds the Panama Canal. Now, if you picture North America and then the little squiggle of Central America all the way down to South America, Panama is a little Central American country at the very northern tip of South America. And it essentially is the skinniest part between the two countries. And the United States had a really big problem, which was if we wanted to imperialize, we needed to have a powerful navy, because all the powerful countries in the world at this time had a powerful navy, and so we needed to do that. But if we wanted to be effective, we would need to have two navies. We would need to have one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic on both sides of the country. And that's just problematic. We can't, having two navies is really complicated and also really expensive. And in order to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean at this point in time, you had to go all the way down and around the southernmost tip of South America. And that's a really, really long journey. And so Teddy Roosevelt realizes that we could actually basically dig a canal, and it's not as short as it looks in this political cartoon, but we could basically dig a canal through Panama, basically divide Panama in half, and connect these two oceans so that our ships can cross between the two. So he puts forward this plan for the Panama Canal in order to avoid having two separate navies. So this was very much in our best interest. This basically shortened the 14,000-mile journey around the tip of South America. It was an enormous task. Geographically, it is not a very short distance. It's actually extremely long. The climate there was extremely hot, humid, not exactly ideal working conditions. Many of the people that were employed to build the Panama Canal died of diseases and other things that they encountered along the way. Colombia was not a fan of this plan, and they were controlling the area at the time, and they refused the United States offer, which was $10 million and $250,000 per year. So $10 million up front, and then $250,000 per year after that the United States used the canal. It was worth that much to us. But the Colombians refused, and this was problematic for us. And so Teddy Roosevelt did what every imperial leader should do. He encouraged some Panamanian peoples to revolt against the Colombian leaders and create their own country, Panama. And so they did. He actually supported them financially. We didn't actually send any troops down there, but we encouraged the Panamanian people to revolt against Colombia. They revolted, and they won, and they took over the country, and Roosevelt got the canal deal. And that's how the Panama Canal was built. So this is kind of one of those shady things that we did during the imperial era to get what we wanted. We basically overthrew a government. So take a look. This is a map of the United States at the end of the imperial era, a map of the world at the end of the imperial era. You'll see that the United States is there in green, and Alaska is in green. Hawaii will eventually become part of our country. Puerto Rico is a tiny island just south of Florida, and that is in green. If you scroll across to Asia, you'll see the Philippines, which are some islands off the coast of China, and Indochina, which is actually Vietnam today. Those are all green places. And so we acquire all of this during this era of extreme competition. Take a look at Spain. Spain is pictured here in brown, and you might notice that you don't see a lot of Spain. We basically knock Spain off the map. Places that were historically Spanish, like Mexico, Peru, and others, are no longer Spanish. They are losing control of all these people that they had settled and controlled for a really long time. So Spain's getting knocked off the map by the United States during the imperial era. Some of the other big countries that you can see, Great Britain is in like a goldish color. You see them all over the world. They have access to so many natural resources. It's unbelievable. Other countries are France. You can see France is controlling most of Africa, a little bit in South America, a little piece. France also controls Vietnam, which at the time was called Indochina, and they also control parts of China in the imperial era. They also control Madagascar. And then Russia. You can see Russia is really growing at this time and expanding their power and control. And they actually control more countries here than they do today. They control parts of Finland. They control the places that today are fighting and dealing with problems, but places like Ukraine, parts of Romania, and others. So the Russian Empire is also expanding. You also notice that places like Russia aren't shy at all about calling themselves an empire, whereas other places like to have the guise of not calling themselves an empire. Okay, so this is what the world looks like at the end of the imperial era, and you can see that United States might be a growing imperial nation, but we aren't nearly as powerful as some of our counterparts, some of the other people in the world, other major countries in the world. It's also important to note that if you look at South America and Central America, they're essentially white, and white on this map means that no imperial country controls them. And this is also an important piece to show that Europe basically respected the Monroe Doctrine and they got out of our territory. And it shows that the United States and Britain are basically the main powers in North and South America. So let's talk about the Spanish-American War. There's a man actually from New Hampshire who called this a splendid little war. And my question to you is, was this actually a splendid little war? Spanish-American War is basically the beginnings of the United States expanding its military power and becoming an imperial nation and acquiring all those little islands that you saw on the map. Cuba was a Spanish colony. Cuba and Cubans started to revolt against Spain. The Spanish were actually torturing and shipping Cubans into concentration camps and other things, and the situation down there was a little nutty. You can see in the political cartoon, the Spanish misrule is causing anarchy and other problems on Cuba. So Spain sent their General Weyler, who to the Americans was called Mad Dog Weyler, to Cuba. And there he imprisoned any rebels that were fighting for their independence from Spain. And ultimately, over 200,000 people died in this conflict going on there. Americans that are watching this conflict happen certainly felt terrible for the Cubans, but there's like mixed feelings. Should we be involved? Should we help them? The Monroe Doctrine said, yeah, kind of, maybe we should. This all is happening pretty early on in President McKinley's presidency, and so we don't have the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and many people don't really know what to do about this situation. And so the United States was initially neutral in this war. After the USS Maine explodes, yellow journalists, which is basically sensationalized journalists or sensationalized news, whipped up support for the war. They said things like, the Spanish ambassador insulted President McKinley. We didn't want to have a black republic. We need to prevent the Cubans we need to go down there and get involved, because if the Cubans win, all the black people down in Cuba will establish their own government, and black people are incapable of government. Therefore, we need to do something about that. And as awful as that sounds and as awful as that is, that's what people of the time thought. Americans also wanted revenge for the explosion of the USS Maine. Two of the journalists at the time, and you should know them, are William Hearst from the New York Journal. We read one of his documents, or one of his articles about the USS Maine in class. and Joseph Pulitzer, writing for the New York World. These two people are actually extremely famous. Pulitzer, obviously, for the Pulitzer Prize. But these two people are famous because they they basically started yellow journalism. They made journalism what it was. The printing press made things a lot cheaper to produce print, and so they made journalism popular. They went on, they competed for sales of their newspapers. They had newsboys whose job it was to sell the newspapers on the streets. In old movies, you see the little newsboys or the newsies as the little guys going, extra, extra, read all about it. They sent those guys out, and they negotiated with them to do that. But they also just exaggerated the news. It was really dramatic. They always had an answer for everything, and exaggerated it, and people enjoyed reading it because it was juicy and interesting. I would liken what they wrote to basically blogs or sort of the tabloids. Interesting, fascinating, not entirely accurate. The United States had some serious interests in Cuba. We first had interest in protecting American businesses and persons in Cuba. We actually sold a lot of oil to Cubans. We had other business people there who were just doing normal business. And so we were growing really worried, especially because of this conflict, that American lives would be threatened in Cuba. We also had interest in protecting Cubans for humanitarian purpose. 200,000 Cubans are dying. We also had an imperial interest in defeating Spain, because if we can defeat Spain and kick them out of Cuba and help the Cubans kick Spain out, then this might be really good for us. So one of the big things that historians have asked is, was the Maine really the cause of the war? The USS Maine exploded off the coast of Cuba. It was a big deal. Several hundred Americans died in this explosion. The articles we read in class talked about how there was possibly a mine. Maybe something went wrong in the engine room. Blah 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 blah. We've never found any evidence in the history since then that Spain had anything to do with the explosion of the USS Maine, and there's no evidence to suggest that happened. The first article was extremely exaggerated. The second article was a bit more practical and realistic, and so it is, by all reasonable guesses, it is most likely that the USS Maine the explosion of the USS Maine was caused by some sort of explosion in the engine room. So, was the USS Maine actually the cause of war? And that's a really, really important question. So, Congress declared war on Spain in April 1898. This took place mainly in Spanish colonies, places like Cuba, also the Philippines, Puerto Rico, etc. The Teller Amendment was an amendment passed in the United States which gave control of Cuba to its people. So basically we said, if we win this war, if Cubans are successful in defeating Spain, then they will get to keep Cuba and determine what happens with Cuba. It also expanded the president's wartime powers and gave McKinley the power to basically do what he needed to do in order to win the war. One thing about the war is that American troops were pretty ill-equipped. You can see here in this picture they're wearing wool uniforms, which were extremely hot for Cuba in April. So many people, they're wearing sort of the wrong thing. Most of the people that died in this war died from disease. The men that enlisted in this war, Teddy Roosevelt was a colonel initially, and then he became vice president. they were known as the Rough Riders. And they were athletes and cowboys. And since, under Abraham Lincoln, African Americans were allowed to enlist in the war, we'd had black men in uniform for decades at this point. And so many black men enlisted in this war in hopes of it improving their social status in the United States. In August of 1898, there was an armistice, and Spain surrendered. John Hay, who was one of our ambassadors at the time, and actually he's from New Hampshire. He had a house at the time on Lake Sunapee in New Hampshire. He called this a splendid little war. There were less than 5,000 U.S. casualties, and the war only lasted for 144 days, so it was very, very short in the big scheme of things. In the end, Cuba became a United States protectorate. A protectorate is a term for a nation, a separate nation, that is controlled by a stronger state. So we basically said to Cuba, you can be your own country, you can be your own nation, you're not part of the United States, you are not one of our states, you're not even one of our territories or our colony, but we are your protector. And so we will protect you. But we passed an amendment called the Platt Amendment, which lasted for 33 years. And this was an amendment to the Teller Amendment. It basically undid the Teller Amendment. And it said, while you are your own nation, you are still our protectorate. And so there are a couple things that you can't do. You're not free to sign your own treaties. We are actually allowed to come in and buy or lease naval bases that we want. And so one of the more important ones that you should know about is a little place called Guantanamo Bay, which still exists today. And we still pay for use of that place. We use it not really as a naval base, but more as a military prison, and today it's talked about a lot in the news because this is where we keep a lot of suspected terrorists. And anytime the United States thinks that it's necessary, we are allowed to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect their independence. How nice of us. So we are basically allowed to do whatever we want with Cuba because we're protecting them. This is a huge insult to Cubans, especially after the Teller Amendment, which had said they can become their own country and they're free to decide what they want to do. We will support them in their independence. And then the Platt Amendment comes along and says, yeah, we supported you in your independence, but we have some stipulations. So, my question for you, and I'd please like you to actually respond to this question. I've been asking you to write these down and bring them into class, but one of the problems with that is that we don't all get to discuss and hear what each other says about this. So what I'd like you to do is, I have this exit question posted as a discussion on our page on Schoology. And so what I'd like you to do is respond to this question. Were American actions in Cuba justified? Go ahead and start a discussion.